Welcome to today's deep dive. We have a really fascinating mission ahead of us today.
We really do.
We are unpacking this massive stack of academic research, um, sociological literature, and just hard empirical data to explore a pretty provocative idea.
Right. The idea that our most elite universities are functioning primarily as wealth sorting mechanisms.
Exactly, rather than the pure meritocracies that we always imagine them to be.
It is a profound shift in how we understand higher education. And we have an incredibly robust set of sources to guide us through this today.
Yeah, we're not just throwing opinions around.
Not at all. We are looking at the empirical gold standard from Raj Chetty's Opportunity Insights, foundational sociological texts by Pierre Bourdieu, and contemporary ground-level analyses from researchers like Lauren Rivera and Anthony Abraham Jack.
To get us started, there was this thought-provoking little internet exchange buried in our source notes that I think perfectly sets the stage for everything we're about to talk about.
Oh, the MIT meme.
Yes, the meme. So someone mentioned a rumor that MIT was allegedly worrying about finding genetic predictors of academic success.
Right.
And another person replied to this by simply pointing out, you can already do this with a zip code.
Which is funny, but what's really fascinating here is how perfectly that internet meme aligns with actual science.
It really does.
We can validate that exact sentiment using established sociological concepts, specifically what scholars call neighborhood effects and spatialized inequality.
Spatialized inequality, I like that term.
Yeah, if you look at the work of Harvard sociologist Robert Sampson in his book Great American City, or Annette Lareau's Unequal Childhoods, they illustrate exactly why a zip code is so highly predictive.
Because it's about the environment, right? For you or anyone listening who's navigating the American education system, a zip code dictates the baseline of your entire trajectory.
Entirely. It determines the local property taxes, which in turn dictates your public school funding.
It dictates teacher quality.
Exactly. Teacher quality, the safety and stability of a neighborhood, the peer networks you have access to.
And even just the amount of free time and resources your parents have to invest in your extracurriculars.
Right. It isn't genetics at all. The wealth of a specific area is basically acting as a proxy for a genetic test for opportunity. It maps out your life chances years before you even sit down to take a standardized test.
Okay, let's unpack this because our sources don't just rely on abstract theory here. They bring the actual receipts.
They absolutely do.
The empirical proof of this wealth sorting is undeniable, especially when we look at the research from Opportunity Insights. We are talking about massive landmark studies from 2017 and 2023.
Led by economists Raj Chetty, David Deming, and John Friedman.
Right, and the sheer volume of the data in those studies is what makes them the gold standard here.
Because the researchers aren't just running, small sample surveys. They aren't relying on self-reported data, which can be skewed.
They cross-referenced anonymized IRS tax records, sweeping census data, and actual internal university records.
To track intergenerational mobility across millions of individuals.
And the staggering fact they reveal, the one that really shatters the myth of a pure meritocracy for anyone paying attention, is that children from the top 1% of the income distribution are more than twice as likely to attend an Ivy Plus school.
More than twice as likely.
Yes, twice as likely as equally qualified middle-income students.
And we really need to emphasize the key word there, which is equally qualified.
Exactly. We are talking about students with the exact same academic abilities, the exact same SAT or ACT scores, similar high school grades.
Yet, the student from the top 1% is overwhelmingly more likely to actually get that acceptance letter and walk onto the campus.
It's wild to see it in raw numbers like that.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to understand that this unequal outcome isn't a glitch in the system.
It's not an accident.
No, it is actually a reflection of the original design. Elite institutions like Harvard and Yale were historically founded precisely to educate the children of wealthy families, the colonial elite, and preserve their societal status across generations.
They were built from the ground up for class reproduction.
Yeah, exactly. And to understand how this historical foundation translates into today's admissions mechanics, we have to look at the foundational concepts of French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu.
From his work, Distinction, I found Bourdieu's framework absolutely fascinating in the sources because it explains so much of the invisible behavior we see on these campuses.
It really does. Bourdieu explains that wealth isn't merely the money sitting in a bank account or a stock portfolio. It operates as capital in three very distinct, transmissible forms.
The first form he identifies is cultural capital. And this isn't money. These are the tastes, the habits, the vocabulary, and just the implicit competencies that elite families pass down to their children.
Right, it's knowing how to casually chat with a professor after a lecture.
Or feeling entirely entitled to walk into an office and ask for a deadline extension without breaking a single sweat.
Yes, exactly. The second form is social capital, which is essentially your network of
For
influence.
connections.
The family, friends who happen to be alumni, the relationships that naturally open doors for you.
And finally, there is symbolic capital, which is just the prestige and the unquestioned legitimacy that comes from being associated with elite institutions.
So what these elite universities essentially do is take this localized, inherited privilege, the cultural and social capital a teenager brings with them from their affluent background, and they convert it into broad institutional legitimacy.
The university basically stamps that pre-existing wealth with the seal of academic merit.
Precisely.
And that brings us right into the campus itself. Because when you look at the student body through this lens of converted capital, our sources map out three very distinct populations coexisting inside the Ivy League.
Which is a breakdown that really shatters the illusion we often hold of a completely homogeneous student body.
Right. We picture this place where everyone is just a solitary academic prodigy studying under an oak tree.
But the sociological literature reveals the actual functional structure. And the first group they identify is the legacy and wealth-based admits.
The data on this specific group is incredibly striking. A 2022 American Sociological Association study, which was paired with Harvard's own internal data made public during recent litigation, shows that legacy preference overwhelmingly benefits wealthy, established families.
It acts as a massive structural mechanism for keeping privilege persistent across generations.
These are the students who arrive on campus having already enjoyed elite prep schools, tens of thousands of dollars in private tutoring, and highly specialized extracurriculars like sailing or fencing.
And sometimes direct donor influence from their families.
Shamas Khan wrote a fantastic book called Privilege, where he actually embedded himself in an elite prep school to study this exact demographic.
And what he found was that these students are essentially taught something he calls effortless superiority.
Effortless superiority. They are trained to navigate highly exclusive, high-stakes environments with this incredible, relaxed ease.
Right, and to the outside world, this practiced comfort looks like raw, natural merit. They are entirely fluent in the cultural capital Bourdieu described. They know the unwritten rules of the institution before they even arrive for freshman orientation.
Now, the second population the sources identify operates under entirely different circumstances. These are the students admitted through DEI-targeted initiatives.
Right.
When the sociological data looks at this second group, it frames their admission strictly through the academic lens of compensatory selection.
The literature treats this mechanism as an institutional effort designed to counterbalance the immense structural disadvantages and spatialized inequality we discussed earlier with the neighborhood effects.
The academic literature objectively views compensatory selection as a tool for institutional diversity, aiming to pull talented individuals from outside those traditional pipelines of wealth.
However, our sources point out that the broader public often misinterprets this mechanism as simply lowering standards.
Which is a narrative that completely ignores the sociological reality of what these students actually endure once they get there.
Exactly. Anthony Abraham Jack explores this profoundly in his book, The Privileged Poor. He highlights the immense structural barriers that low-income students still face after they receive their acceptance letters.
Because navigating an institution fundamentally built for the wealthy is incredibly taxing when you don't possess the cultural or social capital of your peers.
Jack points out granular details that most people never think about, like how universities often close their dining halls over spring break.
That part was heartbreaking to read. A wealthy student flies off to Cabo, but a low-income student who can't afford a flight home is left on an empty campus without any access to food.
It's a perfect example of what it looks like when you are invited to play a complex game where everyone else has had the rule book since birth, and you are trying to learn it while actively competing.
So we have the wealthy legacy students bringing their effortless superiority, and we have the students admitted through compensatory selection navigating a maze of unwritten rules. That brings us to the third group on campus.
The high aptitude minority.
The high aptitude minority.
These are the top percentile scorers, the kids who are producing original peer-reviewed research at 18, winning national science awards, The future Nobel laureates.
The tech founders who legitimately fit the prodigy stereotype.
Exactly. But the key word there is minority.
Very true. Within the sociological framework, these exceptional students are referred to as the signal generators.
Signal generators.
Yes. They are the ones who generate the brilliant, highly visible signal that justifies the institution's entire academic reputation to the outside world.
They are the individuals the university points to in their brochures and their press releases to keep the overarching meritocracy myth alive and well. They provide the institutional cover story. Because if the general public sees a handful of undeniable generational geniuses walking the campus, the natural assumption is that the entire student body is made up of generational geniuses.
But the sources consistently point out that this is just a fraction of the population, which immediately begs the question, where do the rest of them go?
Right.
If only a small minority are these world-changing signal generators, what happens to the vast majority of elite graduates who aren't founding billion-dollar companies or curing diseases?
The data tells us they largely disappear into the conventional professional class. They don't typically become public intellectuals, visionary CEOs, or famous innovators.
The Opportunity Insights data found that while Ivy Plus graduates are indeed overrepresented in certain leadership roles, the vast majority of students at these schools do not enter elite, world-shaping positions.
They secure normal, albeit highly lucrative, professional jobs in finance, consulting, and law.
And the sources outline a fascinating structural reason for this bottleneck, introducing the concept of elite overproduction.
Scholar Peter Turchin discusses this extensively in his book Ages of Discord, alongside economist Thomas Piketty in Capital in the 21st Century.
Elite overproduction happens when a society produces too many highly credentialed individuals who are all chasing too few actual elite roles.
You have thousands of newly minted Ivy League graduates pouring out into the market every single year. But there are only so many Supreme Court seats, Fortune 500 CEO positions, or top-tier academic tenures available.
The math of ambition simply doesn't align with the reality of the societal structure.
And this creates a highly competitive, often anxious bottleneck at the entry point of the elite workforce. Sociologist Lauren Rivera explores exactly how this plays out in her book Pedigree, How Elite Students Get Elite Jobs.
She conducted deep qualitative research on how elite employers, specifically top-tier management consulting firms, investment banks, and white-shoe law firms, actually conduct their hiring processes.
Rivera's findings are incredible because they show that these employers use Ivy League credentials merely as a proxy for class background.
They aren't scouring the transcripts to find the objectively smartest person with the highest grades. They are looking for the person who fits their specific, highly polished corporate culture.
They conduct what are often called airport tests.
Asking themselves if they would want to be stuck in an airport with this candidate.
Exactly. And inevitably, that fit comes down to shared hobbies like crew or lacrosse, shared vacation destinations, and the same relaxed conversational cadence.
Rivera's research effectively proves that these schools are functioning as sorting mechanisms for employers rather than true meritocratic filters.
The employer looks at the elite degree and immediately assumes the candidate possesses the required cultural and social capital.
The degree is a shorthand, confirming they have the pedigree required to comfortably interact with the firm's wealthy corporate clients.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though.
Okay.
You might be listening to this and thinking, well, if they let in a significant block of wealthy kids who aren't necessarily academic superstars, surely a large percentage of them must fail out under the academic pressure, right?
You would assume so. The coursework at these historical institutions is supposed to be incredibly grueling.
But the empirical sources reveal a well-documented, almost counterintuitive phenomenon. Once admitted, elite students almost never fail out.
The statistics regarding graduation rates and GPAs at these institutions are quite revealing. There is a deeply entrenched, complex set of mechanics ensuring their continual success.
First, professors often assume a baseline of high competence simply because the student successfully made it through the highly publicized admission gates. The presumption of brilliance is already there.
Second, there is immense pressure from wealthy families who are paying astronomical, full-price tuition and expect a return on that investment.
And third, the administrative bodies of the schools themselves are deeply incentivized to maintain near-perfect graduation rates to keep their alumni networks satisfied and the donation pipelines flowing.
The grading data reflects this institutional protection perfectly. Stuart Rodstatzer and Christopher Healy conducted extensive studies published on gradeinflation.com, analyzing decades of transcript data.
And they show that Ivy League schools consistently have some of the highest average GPAs in the entire country.
The grades are overwhelmingly inflated across the board. An A is no longer an exception for extraordinary work. It is often the baseline expectation for merely completing the syllabus.
This specific dynamic brings us to the critique leveled by former Yale professor William Deresiewicz in his book Excellent Sheep.
He argues that elite institutions actively protect their students from the very concept of failure.
By entirely removing the risk of failure, providing endless safety nets and great inflation, they end up producing profound conformity rather than true risk-taking excellence.
Students optimize for the guaranteed A rather than pursuing challenging, potentially disruptive intellectual paths.
This ties beautifully back to Pierre Bourdieu's concept of institutionalized cultural capital. Once you make it inside the walls of the institution, the university confers its immense legitimacy onto you, regardless of your actual day-to-day academic performance.
But the embossed degree itself is the capital, not necessarily the actual knowledge you acquired to get it. So what does this all mean? Why should you, listening to this deep dive right now, care about the internal dynamics and grading curves of a handful of ultra-selective colleges?
Because understanding this Ivy League sorting machine completely changes how we view success, how we view corporate hiring, and how we understand the very concept of a meritocracy in our own lives and careers.
It pulls back the curtain on the illusion of raw talent. It reveals that the playing field you are navigating is heavily shaped by a concept called path dependency.
Path dependency.
Yes, early advantages like the zip code you were born in, the property taxes funding your elementary school, or the specific vocabulary your parents used at the dinner table compound exponentially over time.
Path dependency is the crucial takeaway from synthesizing all these sources. It's a snowball effect of privilege. To distill what the data is telling us, elite universities are fundamentally engaging in a practice known as opportunity hoarding.
Opportunity hoard.
Yes. Despite the highly publicized presence of incredibly high aptitude signal generators, the broader institutional mechanism is quietly selecting for pre-existing privilege rather than pure ability. In doing so, these institutions are actively, systematically reproducing existing class structures generation after generation.
It is a sobering realization. When you see someone with a shiny elite credential, the societal default is to assume they are simply the hardest working, most naturally gifted person in the room.
But these sources tell us to look closer. They tell us to look at the massive structural advantages, the accumulated capital, that quietly place them in that room to begin with.
Seeing the system for what it actually is rather than what it claims to be allows us to better navigate it.
This realization raises an important question, and it introduces one final theoretical concept from the sources that built on everything we've discussed today.
What's that?
It draws from sociologists Max Weber and Frank Parkin, who established a concept called status closure.
Status closure.
Yes. Status closure is the idea that elite groups intentionally create and maintain complex, opaque barriers to entry specifically to keep their circles exclusive.
So it's not actually about maintaining rigorous academic standards for the benefit of society. It's about artificially restricting the supply to keep the value of the credential high.
Precisely the mechanism. The complexity of the admissions process, the necessity of specialized extracurriculars, the reliance on early decision, these are all tools of status closure.
Wow.
So, the final thought I want you to ponder is this. If our most esteemed educational institutions are primarily functioning as sophisticated mechanisms for status closure, what does that mean for the future of social mobility and democracy? Are we as a society exhausting ourselves trying to climb a ladder that was specifically designed to be pulled up behind the people who are already at the top?
Are we climbing a ladder designed to be pulled up? That is a profound and necessary question to sit with and a perfect place to leave our discussion. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. We hope unpacking these sources gives you a new lens through which to view the world, and we encourage you to keep questioning the structures around you. Until next time.